Chapter 10 of the Haunted Hotel. In the meantime, Mrs. Ferrari held to her resolution. She went straight from Mr. Troy's office to Newbury's hotel. Lady Montbarry was at home, and alone. But the authorities of the hotel hesitated to disturb her when they found that the visitor declined to mention her name. Her ladyship's new maid happened to cross the hall while the matter was still in debate. She was a Frenchwoman, and, on being appealed to, she settled the question in the swift, easy, rational French way. Madame's appearance was perfectly respectable. Madame might have reasons for not mentioning her name, which Milady might approve. In any case, there being no orders forbidding the introduction of a strange lady, the matter clearly rested between Madame and Milady. Would Madame therefore be good enough to follow Milady's maid up the stairs? In spite of her resolution, Mrs. Ferrari's heart beat as if it would burst out of her bosom when her conductress led her into an anteroom and knocked at a door opening into a room beyond. But it is remarkable that persons of sensitively nervous organization are the very persons who are capable of forcing themselves, apparently by the exercise of a spasmodic effort of will, into the performance of acts of the most audacious courage. A low grave voice from the inner room said, "Come in." The maid, opening the door, announced, "A person to see you, Milady, on business," and immediately retired. In the one instant while these events passed, timid little Mrs. Ferrari mastered her own throbbing heart, stepped over the threshold, conscious of her clammy hands, dry lips, and burning head, and stood in the presence of Lord Montbarry's widow, to all outward appearance as supremely self-possessed as her ladyship herself. It was still early in the afternoon, but the light in the room was dim. The blinds were drawn down. Lady Montbarry sat with her back to the windows, as if even the subdued daylight were disagreeable to her. She had altered sadly for the worse in her personal appearance since the memorable day when Doctor Wybrow had seen her in his consulting room. Her beauty was gone. Her face had fallen away to mere skin and bone. The contrast between her ghastly complexion and her steely, glittering black eyes was more startling than ever. Robed in dismal black, relieved only by the brilliant whiteness of her widow's cap, reclining in a panther-like suppleness of attitude on a little green sofa, she looked at the stranger who had intruded on her, with a moment's languid curiosity, then dropped her eyes again to the hand-screen which she held between her face and the fire. "I don't know you," she said. "What do you want with me?" Mrs. Ferrari tried to answer. Her first burst of courage had already worn itself out. The bold words that she had determined to speak were living words still in her mind, but they died on her lips. There was a moment of silence. Lady Montbarry looked round again at the speechless stranger. "Are you deaf?" she asked. There was another pause. Lady Montbarry quietly looked back again at the screen, and put another question. "Do you want money?" Money! That one word roused the sinking spirit of the courier's wife. She recovered her courage, she found her voice. "Look at me, my lady, if you please," she said, with a sudden outbreak of audacity. Lady Montbarry looked round for the third time. The fatal words passed Mrs. Ferrari's lips. "I come, my lady, to acknowledge the receipt of the money sent to Ferrari's widow." Lady Montbarry's glittering black eyes rested with steady attention on the woman who had addressed her in those terms. Not the faintest expression of confusion or alarm, not even a momentary flutter of interest, stirred the deadly stillness of her face. She reposed as quietly, she held the screen as composedly as ever. The test had been tried, and had utterly failed. There was another silence. Lady Montbarry considered with herself. The smile that came slowly and went away suddenly, the smile at once so sad and so cruel, showed itself on her thin lips. She lifted her screen and pointed with it to a seat at the farther end of the room. "Be so good as to take that chair," she said. Helpless under her first bewildering sense of failure, not knowing what to say or what to do next, Mrs. Ferrari mechanically obeyed. Lady Montbarry, rising on the sofa for the first time, watched her with undisguised scrutiny as she crossed the room, then sank back into a reclining position once more. "No," she said to herself, "the woman walks steadily. She is not intoxicated. The only other possibility is that she may be mad." She had spoken loud enough to be heard. Stung by the insult, Mrs. Ferrari instantly answered her. "I am no more drunk or mad than you are." "No?" said Lady Montbarry. "Then you are only insolent. The ignorant English mind, I have observed, is apt to be insolent in the exercise of unrestrained English liberty. This is very noticeable to us foreigners among you people in the streets. Of course I can't be insolent to you in return. I hardly know what to say to you. My maid was imprudent in admitting you so easily to my room. I suppose your respectable appearance misled her. I wonder who you are. You mentioned the name of a courier who left us very strangely. Was he married by any chance? Are you his wife? And do you know where he is?" Mrs. Ferrari's indignation burst its way through all restraints. She advanced to the sofa; she feared nothing in the fervour and rage of her reply. "I am his widow, and you know it, you wicked woman. Ah! It was an evil hour when Miss Lockwood recommended my husband to be his lordship's courier." Before she could add another word, Lady Montbarry sprang from the sofa with the stealthy suddenness of a cat, seized her by both shoulders, and shook her with the strength and frenzy of a madwoman. "You lie! You lie! You lie!" She dropped her hold at the third repetition of the accusation, and threw up her hands wildly with a gesture of despair. "Oh, Jesu Maria! Is it possible?" she cried. "Can the courier have come to me through that woman?" She turned like lightning on Mrs. Ferrari, and stopped her as she was escaping from the room. "Stay here, you fool! Stay here and answer me! If you cry out, as sure as the heavens are above you, I'll strangle you with my own hands. Sit down again, and fear nothing." "Wretch! It is I who am frightened out of my senses. Confess that you lied when you used Miss Lockwood's name just now. No, I don't believe you on your oath. I will believe nobody but Miss Lockwood herself. Where does she live? Tell me that, you noxious stinging little insect, and you may go." Terrified as she was, Mrs. Ferrari hesitated. Lady Montbarry lifted her hands threateningly, with the long, lean, yellow white fingers outspread and crooked at the tips. Mrs. Ferrari shrank at the sight of them, and gave the address. Lady Montbarry pointed contemptuously to the door, then changed her mind. "No, not yet. You will tell Miss Lockwood what has happened, and she may refuse to see me. I will go there at once, and you shall go with me. As far as the house, not inside of it. Sit down again. I am going to ring for my maid. Turn your back to the door. Your cowardly face is not fit to be seen." She rang the bell. The maid appeared. "My cloak and bonnet, instantly." The maid produced the cloak and bonnet from the bedroom. "A cab at the door! Before I can count 10." The maid vanished. Lady Montbarry surveyed herself in the glass, and wheeled round again, with her cat like suddenness, to Mrs. Ferrari. "I look more than half dead already, don't I?" she said with a grim outburst of irony. "Give me your arm." She took Mrs. Ferrari's arm and left the room. "You have nothing to fear so long as you obey," she whispered on the way downstairs. "You leave me at Miss Lockwood's door, and never see me again." In the hall they were met by the landlady of the hotel. Lady Montbarry graciously presented her companion. "My good friend Mrs. Ferrari, I am so glad to have seen her." The landlady accompanied them to the door. The cab was waiting. "Get in first, good Mrs. Ferrari," said her ladyship, "and tell the man where to go." They were driven away. Lady Montbarry's variable humour changed again. With a low groan of misery, she threw herself back in the cab. lost in her own dark thoughts, as careless of the woman whom she had bent to her iron will as if no such person sat by her side, she preserved a sinister silence until they reached the house where Miss Lockwood lodged. In an instant she roused herself to action. She opened the door of the cab, and closed it again on Mrs. Ferrari before the driver could get off his box. "Take that lady a mile farther on her way home," she said, as she paid the man his fare. The next moment she had knocked at the house door. "Is Miss Lockwood at home?" "Yes, ma'am." She stepped over the threshold. The door closed on her. "Which way, ma'am?" asked the driver of the cab. Mrs. Ferrari put her hand to her head and tried to collect her thoughts. Could she leave her friend and benefactress helpless at Lady Montbarry's mercy? She was still vainly endeavouring to decide on the course that she ought to follow, when a gentleman, stopping at Miss Lockwood's door, happened to look towards the cab window, and saw her. "Are you going to call on Miss Agnes too?" he asked. It was Henry Westwick. Mrs. Ferrari clasped her hands in gratitude as she recognized him. "Go in, sir!" she cried. "Go in directly! That dreadful woman is with Miss Agnes. Go and protect her." "What woman?" Henry asked. The answer literally struck him speechless. With amazement and indignation in his face, he looked at Mrs. Ferrari as she pronounced the hated name of Lady Montbarry. "I'll see to it," was all he said. He knocked at the house door, and he too, in his turn, was let in. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of the Haunted Hotel, a mystery of modern Venice. "Lady Montbarry, miss." Agnes was writing a letter, when the servant astonished her by announcing the visitor's name. Her first impulse was to refuse to see the woman who had intruded on her. But Lady Montbarry had taken care to follow close on the servant's heels. Before Agnes could speak, she had entered the room. "I beg to apologize for my intrusion, Miss Lockwood. I have a question to ask you, in which I am very much interested. No one can answer me but yourself." In low hesitating tones, with her glittering black eyes bent modestly on the ground, Lady Montbarry opened the interview in those words. Without answering, Agnes pointed to a chair. She could do this, and, for the time, she could do no more. All that she had read of the hidden and sinister life in the palace at Venice, all that she had heard of Montbarry's melancholy death and burial in a foreign land, all that she knew of the mystery of Ferrari's disappearance, rushed into her mind when the black-robed figure confronted her, standing just inside the door. The strange conduct of Lady Montbarry added a new perplexity to the doubts and misgivings that troubled her. There stood the adventuress whose character had left its mark on society all over Europe, the fury who had terrified Mrs. Ferrari at the hotel, inconceivably transformed into a timid, shrinking woman. Lady Montbarry had not once ventured to look at Agnes since she had made her way into the room. Advancing to take the chair that had been pointed out to her, she hesitated, put her hand on the rail to support herself, and still remained standing. "Please, give me a moment to compose myself," she said faintly. Her head sank on her bosom. She stood before Agnes like a conscious culprit before a merciless judge. The silence that followed was literally the silence of fear on both sides. In the midst of it, the door was opened once more, and Henry Westwick appeared. He looked at Lady Montbarry with a moment's steady attention, bowed to her with formal politeness, and passed on in silence. At the sight of her husband's brother, the sinking spirit of the woman sprang to life again. Her drooping figure became erect. Her eyes met Westwick's look, brightly defiant. She returned his bow with an icy smile of contempt. Henry crossed the room to Agnes. "Is Lady Montbarry here by your invitation?" he asked quietly. "No." Do you wish to see her?' 'It is very painful to me to see her.' He turned and looked at his sister in law. 'Do you hear that?' he asked coldly. 'I hear it,' she answered, more coldly still. 'Your visit is, to say the least of it, ill timed. Your interference is, to say the least of it, out of place.' With that retort, Lady Montbarry approached Agnes. The presence of Henry Westwick seemed at once to relieve and embolden her. 'Permit me to ask my question, Miss Lockwood,' she said with graceful courtesy. 'It is nothing to embarrass you. When the courier Ferrari applied to my late husband for employment, did you ' Her resolution failed her before she could say more. She sank trembling to the nearest chair, and after a moment's struggle composed herself again. 'Did you permit Ferrari,' she resumed, 'to make sure of being chosen for our courier by using your name?' Agnes did not reply with her customary directness. Trifling as it was, the reference to Montbarry, proceeding from that woman of all others, confused and agitated her. 'I have known Ferrari's wife for many years,' she began, 'and I take an interest ' Lady Montbarry abruptly lifted her hands with a gesture of entreaty. 'Ah, Miss Lockwood, don't waste time by talking of his wife! Answer my plain question plainly.' 'Let me answer her,' Henry whispered. 'I will undertake to speak plainly enough.' Agnes refused by a gesture. Lady Montbarry's interruption had roused her sense of what was due to herself. She resumed her reply in plainer terms. 'When Ferrari wrote to that late Lord Montbarry,' she said, 'he did certainly mention my name.' Even now she had innocently failed to see the object which her visitor had in view. Lady Montbarry's impatience became ungovernable. She started to her feet and advanced to Agnes. 'Was it with your knowledge and permission that Ferrari used your name?' she asked. 'The whole soul of my question is in that. For God's sake, answer me! Yes or no?' 'Yes.' That one word struck Lady Montbarry as a blow might have struck her. The fierce life that had animated her face the instant before faded out of it suddenly, and left her like a woman turned to stone. She stood mechanically, confronting Agnes with a stillness so rapt and perfect that not even the breath she drew was perceptible to the two persons who were looking at her. Henry spoke to her roughly. 'Rouse yourself,' he said. 'You have received your answer.' She looked round at him. 'I have received my sentence,' she rejoined, and turned slowly to leave the room. To Henry's astonishment, Agnes stopped her. 'Wait a moment, Lady Montbarry. I have something to ask, on my side. You have spoken of Ferrari. I wish to speak of him too.' Lady Montbarry bent her head in silence. Her hand trembled as she took out her handkerchief and passed it over her forehead. Agnes detected the trembling, and shrank back a step. 'Is the subject painful to you?' she asked timidly. Still silent, Lady Montbarry invited her by a wave of the hand to go on. Henry approached, attentively watching his sister in law. Agnes went on. 'No trace of Ferrari has been discovered in England,' she said. 'Have you any news of him? And will you tell me if you have heard anything in mercy to his wife?' Lady Montbarry's thin lips suddenly relaxed into their sad and cruel smile. 'Why do you ask me about the lost courier?' she said. 'You will know what has become of him, Miss Lockwood, when the time is ripe for it.' Agnes started. 'I don't understand you,' she said. 'How shall I know? Will some one tell me?' 'Some one will tell you.' Henry could keep silence no longer. 'Perhaps your ladyship may be the person,' he interrupted with ironical politeness. She answered him with contemptuous ease. 'You may be right, Mr. Westwick. One day or another I may be the person who tells Miss Lockwood what has become of Ferrari, if She stopped, with her eyes fixed on Agnes. "If what?" Henry asked. "If Miss Lockwood forces me to it." Agnes listened in astonishment. "Force you to it?" she repeated. "How can I do that? Do you mean to say my will is stronger than yours?" "Do you mean to say that the candle doesn't burn the moth when the moth flies into it?" Lady Montbarry rejoined. "Have you ever heard of such a thing as the fascination of terror? I am drawn to you by a fascination of terror. I have no right to visit you. I have no wish to visit you. You are my enemy. For the first time in my life, against my own will, I submit to my enemy. See! I am waiting because you told me to wait, and the fear of you I swear it creeps through me while I stand here. Oh, don't let me excite your curiosity or your pity. Follow the example of Mr. Westwick. Be hard and brutal and unforgiving, like him. Grant me my release. Tell me to go." The frank and simple nature of Agnes could discover but one intelligible meaning in this strange outbreak. "You are mistaken in thinking me your enemy," she said. "The wrong you did me when you gave your hand to Lord Montbarry was not intentionally done. I forgave you my sufferings in his lifetime. I forgive you even more freely now that he has gone." Henry heard her with mingled emotions of admiration and distress. "Say no more!" he exclaimed. "You are too good to her. She is not worthy of it." The interruption passed unheeded by Lady Montbarry. The simple words in which Agnes had replied seemed to have absorbed the whole attention of this strangely changeable woman. As she listened, her face settled slowly into an expression of hard and tearless sorrow. There was a marked change in her voice when she spoke next. It expressed the last worst resignation which has done with hope. "You good, innocent creature," she said. "What does your amiable forgiveness matter? What are your poor little wrongs, in the reckoning for greater wrongs which is demanded of me? I am not trying to frighten you. I am only miserable about myself. Do you know what it is to have a firm presentiment of calamity that is coming to you, and yet to hope that your own positive conviction will not prove true? When I first met you, before my marriage, and first felt your influence over me, I had that hope. It was a starveling sort of hope that lived a lingering life in me until today. You struck it dead when you answered my question about Ferrari." "How have I destroyed your hopes?" Agnes asked. "What connection is there between my permitting Ferrari to use my name to Lord Montbarry, and the strange and dreadful things you are saying to me now?" "The time is near, Miss Lockwood, when you will discover that for yourself. In the meanwhile, you shall know what my fear of you is, in the plainest words I can find. On the day when I took your hero from you, and blighted your life, I am firmly persuaded of it, you were made the instrument of the retribution that my sins of many years had deserved. Oh, such things have happened before today. One person has, before now, been the means of innocently ripening the growth of evil in another. You have done that already, and you have more to do yet. You have still to bring me to the day of discovery, and to the punishment that is my doom. We shall meet again, here in England, or there in Venice, where my husband died, and meet for the last time." In spite of her better sense, in spite of her natural superiority to superstitions of all kinds, Agnes was impressed by the terrible earnestness with which those words were spoken. She turned pale as she looked at Henry. "Do you understand her?" she asked. "Nothing is easier than to understand her," he replied contemptuously. "She knows what has become of Ferrari, and she is confusing you in a cloud of nonsense because she daren't own the truth. Let her go." If a dog had been under one of the chairs and had barked, Lady Montbarry could not have proceeded more impenetrably with the last words she had to say to Agnes. "Advise your interesting Mrs. Ferrari to wait a little longer," she said. You will know what has become of her husband, and you will tell her. There will be nothing to alarm you. Some trifling event will bring us together the next time, as trifling, I dare say, as the engagement of Ferrari. Sad nonsense, Mr. Westwick, is it not? But you make allowances for women. We all talk nonsense. Good morning, Miss Lockwood." She opened the door suddenly, as if she was afraid of being called back for the second time, and left them. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Haunted Hotel. "Do you think she is mad?" Agnes asked. "I think she is simply wicked. False, superstitious, inveterately cruel, but not mad. I believe her main motive in coming here was to enjoy the luxury of frightening you." "She has frightened me. I am ashamed to own it, but so it is." Henry looked at her, hesitated for a moment, and seated himself on the sofa by her side. "I am very anxious about you, Agnes," he said. "But for the fortunate chance which led me to call here today, who knows what that vile woman might not have said or done, if she had found you alone? My dear, you are leading a sadly unprotected, solitary life. I don't like to think of it. I want to see it changed. Especially after what has happened today. No, no, it is useless to tell me that you have your old nurse. She is too old. She is not in your rank of life. There is no sufficient protection in the companionship of such a person for a lady in your position. Don't mistake me, Agnes. What I say in the sincerity of my devotion to you." He paused and took her hand. She made a feeble effort to withdraw it, and yielded. "Will the day never come," he pleaded, "when the privilege of protecting you may be mine? When you will be the pride and joy of my life as long as my life lasts?" He pressed her hand gently. She made no reply. The color came and went on her face. Her eyes were turned away from him. "Have I been so unhappy as to offend you?" he asked. She answered that. She said, almost in a whisper, "No." "Have I distressed you?" "You have made me think of the sad days that are gone." She said no more. She only tried to withdraw her hand from his for the second time. He still held it. He lifted it to his lips. "Can I never make you think of other days than those, of the happier days to come? Or if you must think of the time that is past, can you not look back to the time when I first loved you?" She sighed as he put the question. "Spare me, Henry," she answered sadly. "Say no more." The color again rose in her cheeks. Her hand trembled in his. She looked lovely, with her eyes cast down and her bosom heaving gently. At that moment he would have given everything he had in the world to take her in his arms and kiss her. Some mysterious sympathy, passing from his hand to hers, seemed to tell her what was in his mind. She snatched her hand away, and suddenly looked up at him. The tears were in her eyes. She said nothing. She let her eyes speak for her. They warned him, without anger, without unkindness, but still they warned him to press her no further that day. "Only tell me that I am forgiven," he said, as he rose from the sofa. "Yes," she answered quietly, "you are forgiven." "I have not lowered myself in your estimation, Agnes?" "Oh no." "Do you wish me to leave?" She rose in her turn from the sofa, and walked to her writing table before she replied. The unfinished letter which she had been writing when Lady Montbarry interrupted her lay open on the blotting book. As she looked at the letter, and then looked at Henry, the smile that charmed everybody showed itself in her face. "You must not go just yet," she said. "I have something to tell you. I hardly know how to express it. The shortest way perhaps will be to let you find it out for yourself. You have been speaking of my lonely, unprotected life here. It is not a very happy life, Henry. I own that." She paused, observing the growing anxiety of his expression as he looked at her, with a shy satisfaction that perplexed him. "Do you know that I have anticipated your idea?" she went on. "I am going to make a great change in my life, if your brother Stephen and his wife will only consent to it." She opened the desk of the writing table while she spoke, took a letter out, and handed it to Henry. He received it from her mechanically. Vague doubts, which he hardly understood himself, kept him silent. It was impossible that the "change" in her life, of which she had spoken, could mean that she was about to be married. And yet he was conscious of a perfectly unreasonable reluctance to open the letter. Their eyes met. She smiled again. "Look at the address," she said. "You ought to know the handwriting, but I dare say you won't." He looked at the address. It was in the large, irregular, uncertain writing of a child. He opened the letter instantly. "Dear Aunt Agnes, our governess is going away. She has had money left to her and a house of her own. We have had cake and wine to drink her health. You promised to be our governess if we wanted another. We want you. Mama knows nothing about this. Please come before Mama can get another governess. Your loving Lucy, who writes this. Clara and Blanche have tried to write too, but they are too young to do it. They blot the paper." "Your eldest niece," Agnes explained, as Henry looked at her in amazement. "The children used to call me aunt when I was staying with their mother in Ireland in the autumn. The three girls were my inseparable companions. They are the most charming children I know. It is quite true that I offered to be their governess if they ever wanted one, on the day when I left them to return to London. I was writing to propose it to their mother just before you came." "Not seriously!" Henry exclaimed. Agnes placed her unfinished letter in his hand. Enough of it had been written to show that she did seriously propose to enter the household of Mr. and Mrs. Stephen Westwick as governess to their children. Henry's bewilderment was not to be expressed in words. "They won't believe you are in earnest," he said. "Why not?" Agnes asked quietly. "You are my brother Stephen's cousin. You are his wife's old friend." "All the more reason, Henry, for trusting me with the charge of their children." "But you are their equal. You are not obliged to get your living by teaching. There is something absurd in your entering their service as a governess." "What is there absurd in it? The children love me, the mother loves me, the father has shown me innumerable instances of his true friendship and regard. I am the very woman for the place. And as to my education, I must have completely forgotten it, indeed, if I am not fit to teach three children, the eldest of whom is only 11 years old. You say I am their equal. Are there no other women who serve as governesses, and who are the equals of the persons whom they serve? Besides, I don't know that I am their equal. Have I not heard that your brother Stephen was the next heir to the title? Will he not be the new lord? Never mind answering me. We won't dispute whether I am right or wrong in turning governess. We will wait the event. I am weary of my lonely, useless existence here, and eager to make my life more happy and more useful, in the household of all others in which I should like most to have a place. If you will look again, you will see that I have these personal considerations still to urge before I finish my letter. You don't know your brother and his wife as well as I do, if you doubt their answer. I believe they have courage enough and heart enough to say yes." Henry submitted without being convinced. He was a man who disliked all eccentric departures from custom and routine, and he felt especially suspicious of the change proposed in the life of Agnes. With new interests to occupy her mind, she might be less favourably disposed to listen to him on the next occasion when he urged his suit. The influence of the lonely, useless existence of which she complained was distinctly an influence in his favour. While her heart was empty, her heart was accessible. But, with his nieces in full possession of it, the clouds of doubt overshadowed his prospects. He knew the sex well enough to keep these purely selfish perplexities to himself. The waiting policy was especially the policy to pursue with a woman as sensitive as Agnes. If he once offended her delicacy, he was lost. For the moment he wisely controlled himself and changed the subject. "My little niece's letter has had an effect," he said, "which the child never contemplated in writing it. She has just reminded me of one of the objects that I had in calling on you today." Agnes looked at the child's letter. "How does Lucy do that?" she asked. "Lucy's governess is not the only lucky person who has had money left her," Henry answered. "Is your old nurse in the house?" "You don't mean to say that nurse has got a legacy?" "She has got £100. Send for her, Agnes, while I show you the letter." He took a handful of letters from his pocket, and looked through them, while Agnes rang the bell. Returning to him, she noticed a printed letter among the rest, which lay open on the table. It was a prospectus, and the title of it was "Palace Hotel Company of Venice, Limited." The two words "Palace" and "Venice" instantly recalled her mind to the unwelcome visit of Lady Montbarry. "What is that?" she asked, pointing to the title. Henry suspended his search, and glanced at the prospectus. "A really promising speculation," he said. "Large hotels always pay well if they are well managed. I know the man who is appointed to be manager of this hotel when it is open to the public, and I have such entire confidence in him that I have become one of the shareholders of the company." The reply did not appear to satisfy Agnes. "Why is the hotel called the Palace Hotel?" she inquired. Henry looked at her, and at once penetrated her motive for asking the question. "Yes," he said, "it is the palace that Montbarry hired at Venice, and it has been purchased by the company to be changed into an hotel." Agnes turned away in silence, and took a chair at the farther end of the room. Henry had disappointed her. His income as a younger son stood in need, as she well knew, of all the additions that he could make to it by successful speculation. But she was unreasonable enough, nevertheless, to disapprove of his attempting to make money already out of the house in which his brother had died. Incapable of understanding this purely sentimental view of a plain matter of business, Henry returned to his papers in some perplexity at the sudden change in the manner of Agnes towards him. Just as he found the letter of which he was in search, the nurse made her appearance. He glanced at Agnes, expecting that she would speak first. She never even looked up when the nurse came in. It was left to Henry to tell the old woman why the bell had summoned her to the drawing room. "Well, nurse," he said, "you have had a windfall of luck. You have had a legacy left you of £100. The nurse showed no outward signs of exultation. She waited a little to get the announcement of the legacy well settled in her mind, and then she said quietly, "Master Henry, who gives me that money, if you please?" "My late brother, Lord Montbarry, gives it to you." Agnes instantly looked up, interested in the matter for the first time. Henry went on. "His will leaves legacies to the surviving old servants of the family. There is a letter from his lawyers authorizing you to apply to them for the money." In every class of society, gratitude is the rarest of all human virtues. In the nurse's class it is extremely rare. Her opinion of the man who had deceived and deserted her mistress remained the same opinion still, perfectly undisturbed by the passing circumstance of the legacy. "I wonder who reminded my lord of the old servants," she said. "He would never have heart enough to remember them himself." Agnes suddenly interposed. Nature, always abhorring monotony, institutes reserves of temper as elements in the composition of the gentlest woman living. Even Agnes could on rare occasions be angry. The nurse's view of Montbarry's character seemed to have provoked her beyond endurance. "If you have any sense of shame in you," she broke out, "you ought to be ashamed of what you have just said. Your ingratitude disgusts me. I leave you to speak with her, Henry. You won't mind it." With this significant intimation that he too had dropped out of his customary place in her good opinion, she left the room. The nurse received the smart reproof administered to her with every appearance of feeling rather amused by it than not. When the door had closed, this female philosopher winked at Henry. "There's a power of obstinacy in young women," she remarked. "Miss Agnes wouldn't give my lord up as a bad one, even when he jilted her. And now she's sweet on him after he's dead. Say a word against him, and she fires up as you see. All obstinacy. It will wear out with time. Stick to her, Master Henry, stick to her." "She doesn't seem to have offended you," said Henry. "She?" the nurse repeated in amazement. "She offend me? I like her in her tantrums. It reminds me of her when she was a baby. Lord bless you, when I go to bid her good night she'll give me a big kiss, poor dear, and say, 'Nurse, I didn't mean it.' About this money, Master Henry. If I was younger I should spend it in dress and jewellery. But I'm too old for that. What shall I do with my legacy when I have got it?" "Put it out at interest," Henry suggested. "Get so much a year for it, you know." "How much shall I get?" the nurse asked. "If you put your £100 into the funds, you will get between £3 and £4 a year." The nurse shook her head. "£3 or £4 a year? That won't do. I want more than that. Look here, Master Henry, I don't care about this bit of money. I never did like the man who has left it to me, though he was your brother. If I lost it all tomorrow, I shouldn't break my heart. I'm well enough off, as it is, for the rest of my days. They say you're a speculator. Put me in for a good thing, there's a dear. Neck or nothing, and that for the funds." She snapped her fingers to express her contempt for security of investment at 3%. Henry produced the prospectus of the Venetian Hotel Company. "You're a funny old woman," he said. "There, you dashing speculator, there is neck or nothing for you. You must keep it a secret from Miss Agnes. Mind, I'm not at all sure that she would approve of my helping you to this investment." The nurse took out her spectacles. "6% guaranteed," she read, "and the directors have every reason to believe that 10% or more will be ultimately realized to the shareholders by the hotel. Put me into that, Master Henry, and wherever you go, for heaven's sake recommend the hotel to your friends." So the nurse, following Henry's mercenary example, had her pecuniary interest too in the house in which Lord Montbarry had died. 3 days passed before Henry was able to visit Agnes again. In that time the little cloud between them had entirely passed away. Agnes received him with even more than her customary kindness. She was in better spirits than usual. Her letter to Mrs. Stephen Westwick had been answered by return of post, and her proposal had been joyfully accepted, with one modification. She was to visit the Westwicks for a month, and, if she really liked teaching the children, she was then to be governess, aunt, and cousin all in one, and was only to go away in an event which her friends in Ireland persisted in contemplating, the event of her marriage. "You see I was right," she said to Henry. He was still incredulous. "Are you really going?" he asked. "I am going next week." "When shall I see you again?" "You know you are always welcome at your brother's house. You can see me when you like." She held out her hand. "Pardon me for leaving you. I am beginning to pack up already." Henry tried to kiss her at parting. She drew back directly. "Why not? I am your cousin," he said. "I don't like it," she answered. Henry looked at her and submitted. Her refusal to grant him his privilege as a cousin was a good sign. It was indirectly an act of encouragement to him in the character of her lover. On the first day in the week, Agnes left London on her way to Ireland. As the event proved, this was not destined to be the end of her journey. The way to Ireland was only the first stage on a roundabout road, the road that led to the palace at Venice. Chapter 13. In the spring of the year 1861, Agnes was established at the country seat of her two friends, now promoted, on the death of the first lord, without offspring, to be the new Lord and Lady Montbarry. The old nurse was not separated from her mistress. A place suited to her time of life had been found for her in the pleasant Irish household. She was perfectly happy in her new sphere, and she spent her first half year's dividend from the Venice Hotel Company with characteristic prodigality in presents for the children. Early in the year, also, the directors of the life insurance offices submitted to circumstances, and paid the £10,000. Immediately afterwards, the widow of the first Lady Montbarry, otherwise the Dowager Lady Montbarry, left England with Baron Rivar for the United States. The Baron's object was announced in the scientific columns of the newspapers to be investigation into the present state of experimental chemistry in the great American Republic. His sister informed inquiring friends that she accompanied him in the hope of finding consolation in change of scene after the bereavement that had fallen on her. Hearing this news from Henry Westwick, then paying a visit at his brother's house, Agnes was conscious of a certain sense of relief. "With the Atlantic between us," she said, "surely I have done with that terrible woman now." Barely a week passed before those words had been spoken, before an event happened which reminded Agnes of the terrible woman once more. On that day, Henry's engagements had obliged him to return to London. He had ventured, on the morning of his departure, to press his suit once more on Agnes, and the children, as he had anticipated, proved to be innocent obstacles in the way of his success. On the other hand, he had privately secured a firm ally in his sister in law. "Have a little patience," the new Lady Montbarry had said, "and leave me to turn the influence of the children in the right direction. If they can persuade her to listen to you, they shall." The two ladies had accompanied Henry and some other guests who went away at the same time to the railway station, and had just driven back to the house, when the servant announced that a person of the name of Rolland was waiting to see her ladyship. "Is it a woman?" "Yes, my lady." Young Lady Montbarry turned to Agnes. "This is the very person," she said, "whom your lawyer thought likely to help him when he was trying to trace the lost courier." "You don't mean the English maid who was with Lady Montbarry at Venice?" "My dear, don't speak of Montbarry's horrid widow by the name which is my name now. Stephen and I have arranged to call her by her foreign title before she was married. I am Lady Montbarry, and she is the Countess. In that way there will be no confusion. Yes, Mrs. Rolland was in my service before she became the Countess's maid. She was a perfectly trustworthy person, with one defect that obliged me to send her away, a sullen temper which led to perpetual complaints of her in the servants' hall. Would you like to see her?" Agnes accepted the proposal, in the faint hope of getting some information for the courier's wife. The complete defeat of every attempt to trace the lost man had been accepted as final by Mrs. Ferrari. She had deliberately arrayed herself in widow's mourning, and was earning her livelihood in an employment which the unwearied kindness of Agnes had procured for her in London. The last chance of penetrating the mystery of Ferrari's disappearance seemed to rest now on what Ferrari's former fellow servant might be able to tell. With highly wrought expectations, Agnes followed her friend into the room in which Mrs. Rolland was waiting. A tall bony woman, in the autumn of life, with sunken eyes and iron grey hair, rose stiffly from her chair, and saluted the ladies with stern submission as they opened the door. A person of unblemished character evidently, but not without visible drawbacks. Big bushy eyebrows, an awfully deep and solemn voice, a harsh unbending manner, a complete absence in her figure of the undulating lines characteristic of the sex, presented virtue in this excellent person under its least alluring aspect. Strangers, on a first introduction to her, were accustomed to wonder why she was not a man. "Are you pretty well, Mrs. Rolland?" "I am as well as I can expect to be, my lady, at my time of life." "Is there anything I can do for you?" "Your ladyship can do me a great favour if you will please speak to my character while I was in your service. I am offered a place to wait on an invalid lady who has lately come to live in this neighbourhood." "Ah, yes, I have heard of her, a Mrs. Carbury, with a very pretty niece, I am told. But, Mrs. Rolland, you left my service some time ago. Mrs. Carbury will surely expect you to refer to the last mistress by whom you were employed.' A flash of virtuous indignation irradiated Mrs. Rolland's sunken eyes. She coughed before she answered, as if her last mistress stuck in her throat. 'I have explained to Mrs. Carbury, my lady, that the person I last served I really cannot give her her title in your ladyship's presence has left England for America. Mrs. Carbury knows that I quitted the person of my own free will, and knows why, and approves of my conduct so far. A word from your ladyship will be amply sufficient to get me the situation.' 'Very well, Mrs. Rolland. I have no objection to be your reference, under the circumstances. Mrs. Carbury will find me at home to morrow until 2 o'clock.' 'Mrs. Carbury is not well enough to leave the house, my lady. Her niece, Miss Haldane, will call and make the inquiries, if your ladyship has no objections.' 'I have not the least objection. The pretty niece carries her own welcome with her. Wait a minute, Mrs. Rolland. This lady is Miss Lockwood, my husband's cousin and my friend. She is anxious to speak to you about the courier who was in the late Lord Montbarry's service at Venice.' Mrs. Rolland's bushy eyebrows frowned in stern disapproval of the new topic of conversation. 'I regret to hear it, my lady,' was all she said. 'Perhaps you have not been informed of what happened after you left Venice?' Agnes ventured to add. 'Ferrari left the palace secretly, and he has never been heard of since.' Mrs. Rolland mysteriously closed her eyes, as if to exclude some vision of the lost courier which was of a nature to disturb a respectable woman. 'Nothing that Mr. Ferrari could do would surprise me,' she replied in her deepest bass tones. 'You speak rather harshly of him,' said Agnes. Mrs. Rolland suddenly opened her eyes again. 'I speak harshly of nobody without reason,' she said. 'Mr. Ferrari behaved to me, Miss Lockwood, as no man living has ever behaved before or since.' 'What did he do?' Mrs. Rolland answered with a stony stare of horror. 'He took liberties with me.' Young Lady Montbarry suddenly turned aside and put her handkerchief over her mouth in convulsions of suppressed laughter. Mrs. Rolland went on with a grim enjoyment of the bewilderment which her reply had produced in Agnes. 'And when I insisted on an apology, Miss, he had the audacity to say that the life at the palace was dull, and he didn't know how else to amuse himself.' 'I am afraid I have hardly made myself understood,' said Agnes. 'I am not speaking to you out of any interest in Ferrari. Are you aware that he is married?' 'I pity his wife,' said Mrs. Rolland. 'She is naturally in great grief about him,' Agnes proceeded. 'She ought to thank God she is rid of him,' Mrs. Rolland interposed. Agnes still persisted. 'I have known Mrs. Ferrari from her childhood, and I am sincerely anxious to help her in this matter. Did you notice anything, while you were at Venice, that would account for her husband's extraordinary disappearance? On what sort of terms, for instance, did he live with his master and mistress?' 'On terms of familiarity with his mistress,' said Mrs. Rolland, 'which were simply sickening to a respectable English servant. She used to encourage him to talk to her about all his affairs, how he got on with his wife, and how pressed he was for money, and such like, just as if they were equals. Contemptible, that's what I call it.' 'And his master,' Agnes continued. 'How did Ferrari get on with Lord Montbarry?' 'My lord used to live shut up with his studies and his sorrows,' Mrs. Rolland answered, with a hard solemnity expressive of respect for his lordship's memory. 'Mr. Ferrari got his money when it was due, and he cared for nothing else. If I could afford it, I would leave the place too, but I can't afford it.' Those were the last words he said to me, on the morning when I left the palace. I made no reply. After what had happened on that other occasion, I was naturally not on speaking terms with Mr. Ferrari.' 'Can you really tell me nothing which will throw any light on this matter?' 'Nothing,' said Mrs. Rolland, with an undisguised relish of the disappointment that she was inflicting. "There was another member of the family at Venice," Agnes resumed, determined to sift the question to the bottom while she had the chance. "There was Baron Rivar." Mrs. Rolland lifted her large hands, covered with rusty black gloves, in mute protest against the introduction of Baron Rivar as a subject of inquiry. "Are you aware, miss," she began, "that I left my place in consequence of what I observed?" Agnes stopped her there. "I only wanted to ask," she explained, "if anything was said or done by Baron Rivar which might account for Ferrari's strange conduct." "Nothing that I know of," said Mrs. Rolland. "The Baron and Mr. Ferrari, if I may use such an expression, were birds of a feather, so far as I could see. I mean, one was as unprincipled as the other. I am a just woman, and I will give you an example. Only the day before I left, I heard the Baron say, through the open door of his room, while I was passing along the corridor, 'Ferrari, I want £1,000. What would you do for £1,000?' And I heard Mr. Ferrari answer, 'Anything, sir, as long as I was not found out.' And then they both burst out laughing. I heard no more than that. Judge for yourself, miss." Agnes reflected for a moment. £1,000 was the sum that had been sent to Mrs. Ferrari in the anonymous letter. Was that enclosure in any way connected, as a result, with the conversation between the Baron and Ferrari? It was useless to press any more inquiries on Mrs. Rolland. She could give no further information which was of the slightest importance to the object in view. There was no alternative but to grant her dismissal. One more effort had been made to find a trace of the lost man, and once again the effort had failed. They were a family party at the dinner table that day. The only guest left in the house was a nephew of the new Lord Montbarry, the eldest son of his sister, Lady Barville. Lady Montbarry could not resist telling the story of the first and last attack made on the virtue of Mrs. Rolland, with a comically exact imitation of Mrs. Rolland's deep and dismal voice. Being asked by her husband what was the object which had brought that formidable person to the house, she naturally mentioned the expected visit of Mrs. Haldane. Arthur Barville, unusually silent and preoccupied so far, suddenly struck into the conversation with a burst of enthusiasm. "Miss Haldane is the most charming girl in all Ireland," he said. "I caught sight of her yesterday over the wall of her garden, as I was riding by. What time is she coming to morrow? Before 2. I'll look into the drawing room by accident. I am dying to be introduced to her." Agnes was amused by his enthusiasm. "Are you in love with Miss Haldane already?" she asked. Arthur answered gravely, "It's no joking matter. I have been all day at the garden wall waiting to see her again. It depends on Miss Haldane to make me the happiest or the wretchedest man living." "You foolish boy! How can you talk such nonsense?" He was talking nonsense, undoubtedly. But if Agnes had only known it, he was doing something more than that. He was innocently leading her another stage nearer, on the way to Venice. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. As the summer months advanced, the transformation of the Venetian palace into the modern hotel proceeded rapidly towards completion. The outside of the building, with its fine Palladian front looking on the canal, was wisely left unaltered. Inside, as a matter of necessity, the rooms were almost rebuilt, so far at least as the size and the arrangement of them were concerned. The vast saloons were partitioned off into apartments containing 3 or 4 rooms each. The broad corridors in the upper regions afforded spare space enough for rows of little bedchambers devoted to servants and to travellers with limited means. Nothing was spared but the solid floors and the finely carved ceilings. These last, in excellent preservation as to workmanship, merely required cleaning and regilding here and there, to add greatly to the beauty and importance of the best rooms in the hotel. The only exception to the complete reorganization of the interior was at one extremity of the edifice, on the first and second floors. Here there happened in each case to be rooms of such comparatively moderate size, and so attractively decorated, that the architect suggested leaving them as they were. It was afterwards discovered that these were no other than the apartments formerly occupied by Lord Montbarry on the first floor, and by Baron Rivar on the second. The room in which Montbarry had died was still fitted up as a bedroom, and was now distinguished as Number 14. The room above it, in which the Baron had slept, took its place on the hotel register as Number 38. With the ornaments on the walls and ceilings cleaned and brightened up, and with the heavy old-fashioned beds, chairs, and tables replaced by bright, pretty, and luxurious modern furniture, these two promised to be at once the most attractive and the most comfortable bedchambers in the hotel. As for the once desolate and disused ground floor of the building, it was now transformed, by means of splendid dining rooms, reception rooms, billiard rooms, and smoking rooms, into a palace by itself. Even the dungeon-like vaults beneath, now lighted and ventilated on the most approved modern plan, had been turned, as if by magic, into kitchens, servants' offices, ice-rooms, and wine-cellars, worthy of the splendour of the grandest hotel in Italy, in the now bygone period of 17 years since. Passing from the lapse of the summer months at Venice to the lapse of the summer months in Ireland, it is next to be recorded that Mrs. Rolland obtained the situation of attendant on the invalid Mrs. Carbury, and that the fair Miss Haldane, like a female Caesar, came, saw, and conquered, on her first day's visit to the new Lord Montbarry's house. The ladies were as loud in her praises as Arthur Barville himself. Lord Montbarry declared that she was the only perfectly pretty woman he had ever seen who was really unconscious of her own attractions. The old nurse said she looked as if she had just stepped out of a picture, and wanted nothing but a gilt frame round her to make her complete. Miss Haldane, on her side, returned from her first visit to the Montbarrys, charmed with her new acquaintances. Later on the same day Arthur called with an offering of fruit and flowers for Mrs. Carbury, and with instructions to ask if she was well enough to receive Lord and Lady Montbarry and Miss Lockwood on the morrow. In a week's time the two households were on the friendliest terms. Mrs. Carbury, confined to the sofa by a spinal malady, had been hitherto dependent on her niece for one of the few pleasures she could enjoy, the pleasure of having the best new novels read to her as they came out. Discovering this, Arthur volunteered to relieve Miss Haldane at intervals in the office of reader. He was clever at mechanical contrivances of all sorts, and he introduced improvements in Mrs. Carbury's couch, and in the means of conveying her from the bedchamber to the drawing room, which alleviated the poor lady's sufferings and brightened her gloomy life. With these claims on the gratitude of the aunt, aided by the personal advantages which he unquestionably possessed, Arthur advanced rapidly in the favour of the charming niece. She was, it is needless to say, perfectly well aware that he was in love with her, while he was himself modestly reticent on the subject, so far as words went. But she was not equally quick in penetrating the nature of her own feelings towards Arthur. Watching the two young people with keen powers of observation necessarily concentrated on them by the complete seclusion of her life, the invalid lady discovered signs of roused sensibility in Miss Haldane, when Arthur was present, which had never yet shown themselves in her social relations with other admirers eager to pay their addresses to her. Having drawn her own conclusions in private, Mrs. Carbury took the first favourable opportunity, in Arthur's interests, of putting them to the test. "I don't know what I shall do," she said one day, "when Arthur goes away." Miss Haldane looked up quickly from her work. "Surely he is not going to leave us?" she exclaimed. "My dear, he has already stayed at his uncle's house a month longer than he intended. His father and mother naturally expect to see him at home again." Miss Haldane met this difficulty with a suggestion which could only have proceeded from a judgment already disturbed by the ravages of the tender passion. "Why can't his father and mother go and see him at Lord Montbarry's?" she asked. "Sir Theodore's place is only 30 miles away, and Lady Barville is Lord Montbarry's sister. They needn't stand on ceremony." "They may have other engagements," Mrs. Carbury remarked. "My dear aunt, we don't know that. Suppose you ask Arthur." "Suppose you ask him." Miss Haldane bent her head again over her work. Suddenly as it was done, her aunt had seen her face, and her face betrayed her. When Arthur came the next day, Mrs. Carbury said a word to him in private while her niece was in the garden. The last new novel lay neglected on the table. Arthur followed Miss Haldane into the garden. The next day he wrote home, enclosing in his letter a photograph of Miss Haldane. Before the end of the week, Sir Theodore and Lady Barville arrived at Lord Montbarry's, and formed their own judgment of the fidelity of the portrait. They had themselves married early in life, and, strange to say, they did not object on principle to the early marriages of other people. The question of age being thus disposed of, the course of true love had no other obstacles to encounter. Miss Haldane was an only child, and was possessed of an ample fortune. Arthur's career at the university had been creditable, but certainly not brilliant enough to present his withdrawal in the light of a disaster. As Sir Theodore's eldest son, his position was already made for him. He was 22 years of age, and the young lady was 18. There was really no producible reason for keeping the lovers waiting, and no excuse for deferring the wedding day beyond the first week in September. In the interval, while the bride and bridegroom would be necessarily absent on the inevitable tour abroad, a sister of Mrs. Carbury volunteered to stay with her during the temporary separation from her niece. On the conclusion of the honeymoon, the young couple were to return to Ireland, and were to establish themselves in Mrs. Carbury's spacious and comfortable home. These arrangements were decided upon early in the month of August. About the same date, the last alterations in the old palace at Venice were completed. The rooms were dried by steam, the cellars were stocked, the manager collected round him his army of skilled servants, and the new hotel was advertised all over Europe to open in October. Chapter 15 of The Haunted Hotel. A Mystery of Modern Venice. Miss Agnes Lockwood to Mrs. Ferrari. I promised to give you some account, dear Emily, of the marriage of Mr. Arthur Barville and Miss Haldane. It took place 10 days since, but I have had so many things to look after in the absence of the master and mistress of this house, that I am only able to write to you today. The invitations to the wedding were limited to members of the families on either side in consideration of the ill health of Miss Haldane's aunt. On the side of the Montbarry family there were present, besides Lord and Lady Montbarry, Sir Theodore and Lady Barville, Mrs. Norbury, whom you may remember as his lordship's second sister, and Mr. Francis Westwick and Mr. Henry Westwick. The 3 children and I attended the ceremony as bridesmaids. We were joined by 2 young ladies, cousins of the bride, and very agreeable girls. Our dresses were white, trimmed with green in honour of Ireland, and we each had a handsome gold bracelet given to us as a present from the bridegroom. If you add to the persons whom I have already mentioned the elder members of Mrs. Carbury's family, and the old servants in both houses, privileged to drink the healths of the married pair at the lower end of the room, you will have the list of the company at the wedding breakfast complete. The weather was perfect, and the ceremony, with music, was beautifully performed. As for the bride, no words can describe how lovely she looked, or how well she went through it all. We were very merry at the breakfast, and the speeches went off on the whole quite well enough. The last speech, before the party broke up, was made by Mr. Henry Westwick, and was the best of all. He offered a happy suggestion at the end which has produced a very unexpected change in my life here. As well as I remember, he concluded in these words: "On one point we are all agreed. We are sorry that the parting hour is near, and we should be glad to meet again." Why should we not meet again? This is the autumn time of the year. We are most of us leaving home for the holidays. What do you say, if you have no engagements that will prevent it, to joining our young married friends before the close of their tour, and renewing the social success of this delightful breakfast by another festival in honor of the honeymoon? The bride and bridegroom are going to Germany and the Tyrol on their way to Italy. I propose that we allow them a month to themselves, and that we arrange to meet them afterwards in the north of Italy, say at Venice." This proposal was received with great applause, which was changed into shouts of laughter by no less a person than my dear old nurse. The moment Mr. Westwick pronounced the word Venice, she started up among the servants at the lower end of the room, and called out at the top of her voice, "Go to our hotel, ladies and gentlemen. We get 6% on our money already, and if you will only crowd the place and call for the best of everything, it will be 10% in our pockets in no time. Ask Master Henry." Appealed to in this irresistible manner, Mr. Westwick had no choice but to explain that he was concerned as a shareholder in a new hotel company at Venice, and that he had invested a small sum of money for the nurse, not very considerately as I think, in the speculation. Hearing this, the company, by way of humouring the joke, drank a new toast: success to the nurse's hotel, and a speedy rise in the dividend. When the conversation returned in due time to the more serious question of the proposed meeting at Venice, difficulties began to present themselves, caused of course by invitations for the autumn which many of the guests had already accepted. Only 2 members of Mrs. Carbury's family were at liberty to keep the proposed appointment. On our side, we were more at leisure to do as we pleased. Mr. Henry Westwick decided to go to Venice in advance of the rest, to test the accommodation of the new hotel on the opening day. Mrs. Norbury and Mr. Francis Westwick volunteered to follow him, and, after some persuasion, Lord and Lady Montbarry consented to a species of compromise. His lordship could not conveniently spare time enough for the journey to Venice, but he and Lady Montbarry arranged to accompany Mrs. Norbury and Mr. Francis Westwick as far on their way to Italy as Paris. 5 days since they took their departure to meet their travelling companions in London, leaving me here in charge of the 3 dear children. They begged hard, of course, to be taken with papa and mamma, but it was thought better not to interrupt the progress of their education, and not to expose them, especially the 2 younger girls, to the fatigues of travelling. I have had a charming letter from the bride this morning, dated Cologne. You cannot think how artlessly and prettily she assures me of her happiness. Some people, as they say in Ireland, are born to good luck, and I think Arthur Barville is one of them. When you next write, I hope to hear that you are in better health and spirits, and that you continue to like your employment. Believe me, sincerely your friend, A. L. Agnes had just closed and directed her letter, when the eldest of her 3 pupils entered the room with the startling announcement that Lord Montbarry's travelling servant had arrived from Paris. Alarmed by the idea that some misfortune had happened, she ran out to meet the man in the hall. Her face told him how seriously he had frightened her, before she could speak. "There's nothing wrong, miss," he hastened to say. "My lord and my lady are enjoying themselves at Paris. They only want you and the young ladies to be with them." Saying these amazing words, he handed to Agnes a letter from Lady Montbarry. "Dearest Agnes," she read, "I am so charmed with the delightful change in my life. It is 6 years, remember, since I last travelled on the Continent, that I have exerted all my fascinations to persuade Lord Montbarry to go on to Venice. And, what is more to the purpose, I have actually succeeded. He has just gone to his room to write the necessary letters of excuse in time for the post to England. May you have as good a husband, my dear, when your time comes. In the meanwhile, the one thing wanting now to make my happiness complete is to have you and the darling children with us. Montbarry is just as miserable without them as I am, though he doesn't confess it so freely. You will have no difficulties to trouble you. Louise will deliver these hurried lines, and will take care of you on the journey to Paris. Kiss the children for me 1,000 times, and never mind their education for the present. Pack up instantly, my dear, and I will be fonder of you than ever. Your affectionate friend, Adela Montbarry. Agnes folded up the letter, and feeling the need of composing herself, took refuge for a few minutes in her own room. Her first natural sensations of surprise and excitement at the prospect of going to Venice were succeeded by impressions of a less agreeable kind. With the recovery of her customary composure came the unwelcome remembrance of the parting words spoken to her by Montbarry's widow. "We shall meet again, here in England, or there in Venice, where my husband died, and meet for the last time." It was an odd coincidence, to say the least of it, that the march of events should be unexpectedly taking Agnes to Venice after those words had been spoken. Was the woman of the mysterious warnings and the wild black eyes still thousands of miles away in America? Or was the march of events taking her unexpectedly too on the journey to Venice? Agnes started out of her chair, ashamed of even the momentary concession to superstition which was implied by the mere presence of such questions as these in her mind. She rang the bell, and sent for her little pupils, and announced their approaching departure to the household. The noisy delight of the children, the inspiriting effort of packing up in a hurry, roused all her energies. She dismissed her own absurd misgivings from consideration with the contempt that they deserved. She worked as only women can work when their hearts are in what they do. The travellers reached Dublin that day in time for the boat to England. 2 days later they were with Lord and Lady Montbarry at Paris. End of chapter 15.